CBS News projects New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy will keep his job. Yesterday at this time, Governor Murphy and Republican challenger Jack Ciattarelli were neck and neck, but as vote counts continue to come in, Murphy is pulled ahead in a state many thought would be an easy win for Democrats. He addressed his supporters last night after news outlets projected his victory.
I renew my promise to you, whether you voted for me or not, to work every single day of the next 4 years to keep moving us forward with renewed optimism to ensure greater opportunities for all 9.3 million who call the Garden State their home.
All right, let's bring in Matt Arco to talk about this race. He's a politics reporter for the Star-Ledger and NewJersey.com. Matt, good to see you. New Jersey is typically a safe state for Democrats. That being said, Murphy is the first Democratic governor to win re-election in New Jersey since 1977. And in your headline yesterday for NJ.com, you wrote Murphy won a, quote, bruising New Jersey governor's race. I like that word bruising when describing New Jersey. I feel like a lot of people in New Jersey are bruisers. And I say that with all due respect and love in my heart. So why was this such an uphill battle for him?
Well, look, it was an uphill battle because public polling showed that it was going to be a very comfortable win for Phil Murphy, and that clearly, on election day, I'll say at 8 p.m., at 9 p.m., and 10 p.m., maybe dropping off at 10 p.m., Murphy officials were feeling very confident, and then very quickly it became clear as the results were coming in that they were basically in trouble. Republicans were running up numbers in larger margins that they did 4 years ago, and the governor wasn't performing at the same rate in some areas. I mean, he got more votes, but he wasn't performing overwhelmingly that he did in 4 years ago that he needed to.
The race, though, is not over, at least for his competitor, Jack Ciattarelli. Shortly after the AP called the race for Governor Murphy last night, Ciattarelli's communications director tweeted saying that the race was still too close and, quote, it's irresponsible of the media to make this call. So we had explained earlier why the media, AP, and CBS News, why we are making this projection, and it has a lot to do with the areas of the state that strongly lean Republican, and that most of those votes are already accounted for. But is Ciattarelli's campaign setting up a challenge to these election results?
Yes, it looks like they are. That's what they're indicating. And in New Jersey, we don't have automatic recounts. What we do, or what the system in New Jersey, is that if a candidate wants to challenge, they have to go to superior courts to challenge that. If the election results are within a 1% margin, the state essentially pays for that. But if it's outside of that, which it is right now, then the candidate has to pay for that. And I don't have any doubt that Jack Ciattarelli will be able to raise those funds if need be. But look, as you alluded to, there's still votes out there that are that need to be counted, but those are overwhelmingly in Democratic areas. The largest spot is in Essex County, which is heavily swings blue in New Jersey. And I think the last that I checked, there was about 9% of precincts haven't reported yet. So the thinking is that while the governor has a 25,000 or so edge in the race, that the margin is just going to increase for Phil Murphy.
Right. So what made Ciattarelli such a viable candidate for so many voters in New Jersey? And did a lot of people who typically vote Democratic flip this time around? And I ask that because when I looked a little bit at Governor Murphy's background, I mean, this guy was a Wall Street banker. He was a Goldman Sachs banker for many years, made millions of dollars. Ciattarelli's also a businessman. And I just sort of wondered, it struck me that they were almost two sides of the same coin, but that perhaps one was clearly center-right and one was center-left, but they're not, both of them are not on the extreme edges of their party and where their parties are.
No, yeah, I don't think it was an issue as much of Democrats switching. Being out on the campaign trail, it was very clear that there was an enthusiasm gap, a large one. Going out in the field with Jack Ciattarelli, those folks were fired up. Those folks were ready to go. It was clear they were going to come out to vote. Going out on the campaign trail with Phil Murphy, some of the events were really sort of lukewarm. There was just, again, a large enthusiasm gap. And that's what now that the dust has settled, is that we've seen in Republican areas, folks came out in large numbers, not in presidential year election numbers, but 4 years ago at this time, they came out in much larger numbers than they did for that Republican candidate. That is probably in part to national politics bleeding into New Jersey, something that doesn't, this is a little bit of new territory. Of course, national politics always plays a role, but it is playing an increased role in a state like New Jersey that has these off-year elections. Those folks were fired up and ready to go, and they came out.
You know, the same thing was said in Virginia as well. And now I'm wondering, look, my next question was going to be to ask you about in-person voting and how that went, because this is the first year that Jersey had early in-person voting. But I also wonder, because many experts say, and though sometimes it's disputed, that in-person vote, or rather early voting, often leans towards the Democratic candidate, that if Democrats are voting early, they're just generally going to be less enthusiastic to show up to a rally when they've already made their decision. And maybe, maybe it's sort of one thing feeds to another. There's less enthusiasm at this rally, so there's less enthusiasm overall, even though people are actually voting.
Well, yes, New Jersey had early in-person voting for the very first time this election, and the numbers were not impressive at all. It was very low turnout with early in-person voting. There were larger numbers of folks who voted by mail. That's true. But, it wasn't, we have 6.5 million registered voters, and we had hundreds of thousands of people vote early. So it's, and also based off the results, I don't know that you can draw the connection that those folks they already cast their ballot and they didn't need to go to a rally. And we're also talking about, 2 months before anybody was even able to vote, this enthusiasm gap, just seeing it at these campaign events. But yeah, no, New Jersey it appears slow to adapt to early in-person voting, just based off of the low numbers that actually went to the polls ahead of time.
Yeah, Matt, one of the things I also think what's sort of interesting is what you and Anne-Marie were just discussing, which is the enthusiasm gap, right? The 2020 election was interesting because a lot of people, Democrats certainly, but also some independents, voted. Sometimes these elections are about voting against somebody as much as they are voting for somebody, right? And so you probably saw a lot of people that voted against President Trump to vote for President Biden. Here in this election, which is happening in an off year, it certainly seems as there was a little wind at the sail in the back of sails of Republicans, because they could sort of get on these issues like education, like COVID mandates, that Democrats, it didn't seem to me that there was anything that was exciting enough for Democrats to come out for. And that's unfortunate, because there are a lot of things that President Biden is hoping to accomplish, but that he can't get over the finish line because he doesn't have enough votes. He doesn't have an overwhelming majority in the House, and he has a very razor-thin majority in the Senate, and that's a problem for Democrats.
Sure. Look, but, President Biden's approval rating nationally has dropped, and the same has been said about his approval, and the same can be said about his approval rating in New Jersey when it comes down to the enthusiasm gap. But, look, what happened here in New Jersey was a little bit different. Typically, when Republican candidates, the winning strategy for them in New Jersey is to focus on things like property taxes, right? If you're a charismatic Republican that can focus on something that's near and dear to every New Jerseyan's heart, because the extremely high taxes that we pay in the state, that's the winning strategy. That's what Chris Christie did. Jack Ciattarelli did focus on property taxes, but he also focused on national issues, which was a departure from the past, talking about, suggesting that, dipping his toe into critical race theory, comments about what they were teaching in schools about homosexuality. It was interesting that after the primary, some political observers were sort of scratching their heads saying, well, wait a minute, what is a Republican candidate doing talking about these things? This isn't the winning strategy in New Jersey. At the time, those folks were saying that he was probably making a calculated bet that the folks that or that are pro-Trump, that came out for the very first time in New Jersey to vote for former President Donald Trump, that he wanted to energize, enthuse them, and make sure that they came out a second time. And the folks that I talked to months ago were saying that that's not going to be a winning strategy because that's only going to pick you up a few points. Clearly, that wasn't the case. They came out. They were energized. And I attended multiple town halls that Jack Ciattarelli hosted, and the things that people wanted to know about. Sure, they would ask about taxes, but they were also asking about critical race theory. They were asking about these other social issues that just normally Republican candidates running statewide don't tend to touch on, because and I'll end with that, is because Democrats outnumber Republicans by more than 1 million registered voters in the state. So the idea is if you're a Republican candidate, you need to get every single Republican for you. You need to get a bunch of independents, and hopefully you get a handful of Democrats. But what we saw is that with the enthusiasm gap, he got a bunch of Republicans, probably a bunch of independents, and Democrats weren't by and large, since it was razor thin, weren't scrambling to get to the polls.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, that's really great analysis, Matt. Matt Arco, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So you can follow local coverage of this story from CBSN New York. Just download the free CBS News app or head on over to cbsnews.com/live. There you can find all of the local CBSN streams.